Trump has spent years telling the world he's one of the smartest people alive. He's called himself a stable genius, bragged about having a massive IQ, mocked opponents as low IQ, and constantly acted like he was intellectually untouchable. But one night on live television, Stephen Colbert decided to stop joking about the claims and finally test them. And what happened next turned into one of the most uncomfortable and explosive late-night moments viewers had seen in years. The show started normally. The band played, the audience cheered, and Colbert walked onto the stage smiling and waving like always. But once he sat behind the desk, something felt different immediately. Instead of opening with jokes, he looked directly into the camera and said quietly, "Tonight, we're going to talk about Donald Trump's favorite subject, how smart Donald Trump says Donald Trump is." The audience laughed instantly. Then the screen behind him lit up, showing footage from a recent Trump rally. Trump stood at the podium pointing toward the crowd saying, "I have a 180 IQ, folks, believe me, probably the highest IQ of any president ever." The crowd in the clip exploded cheering while Trump smiled proudly. Colbert let the video finish completely before freezing the frame on Trump's grin. Then for nearly 10 seconds he said absolutely nothing. The audience slowly stopped laughing as the silence dragged on. Finally, Colbert leaned forward slightly and said, "You ever notice that genuinely brilliant people usually don't need to remind everybody they're brilliant every single week?" The audience burst out laughing again, but the mood had already shifted. This didn't feel like a normal monologue anymore. Then Colbert reached beneath the desk and slowly placed a plain manila folder in front of him. No dramatic music, no giant reveal graphic, just paper. But the second viewers saw the folder, people leaned forward in their seats because they knew something bigger was coming. Colbert opened it carefully and started flipping through pages slowly. "Donald Trump has spent decades building a legend around his intelligence," he said calmly. "So tonight, let's compare the legend to the actual record." That line changed the entire energy in the room. Suddenly, the audience wasn't just laughing anymore, they were listening. Colbert started with Trump's time at Wharton. Trump had referenced Wharton for years as proof that he was operating on another intellectual level. He constantly described himself as one of the smartest students there. But according to the records Colbert displayed on screen, there was no evidence of Trump being at the top of his class, no extraordinary academic awards, no elite distinction, just average to good grades, normal performance, nothing legendary. Colbert looked at the camera and said, "And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with average grades. Most successful people had average grades. The strange part is turning average grades into a superhero origin story for 50 years. The audience applauded loudly. Then Colbert held up another page and read a comment reportedly written by one of Trump's professors, describing him as someone who relied heavily on confidence and bold claims rather than detailed analytical reasoning. The audience went almost silent, because the description sounded painfully familiar. Colbert paused and said softly, "That may actually be the most accurate political prediction ever written." Huge laughter exploded through the theater, but Colbert kept moving. He flipped another page and said, "Now let's talk about the famous IQ number." The room instantly got tense again. "An IQ of 180, Colbert explained, would place somebody among the most intellectually rare human beings on Earth." The audience laughed lightly. Then Colbert continued, "At that level, people are usually solving impossible mathematical theories, not rage posting at celebrities before sunrise." The crowd erupted. Some people stood up clapping, others covered their faces laughing. But then the segment suddenly took a turn nobody expected. The side screen lit up and Donald Trump himself appeared live remotely from one of his offices. The audience gasped immediately. Trump looked confident at first, smiling, pointing toward the camera, ready for a fight. "Stephen," Trump started loudly, "everybody knows I'm a genius. Everybody. I built an empire. I became president. You don't do that by being stupid." Colbert listened calmly without interrupting while Trump kept talking louder and louder. Then when Trump paused, Colbert simply replied, "Success and intelligence are not the same thing, Donald." The audience exploded instantly. Trump's face tightened immediately. "This is fake news," Trump snapped. "You people are obsessed with me because I'm successful." Colbert nodded slightly and said, "Notice something interesting here. Every time evidence comes up, you immediately switch to talking about money and ratings." Another massive audience reaction. Trump tried talking over him, but Colbert never raised his voice once. That contrast quickly became the entire story of the night. Trump sounded emotional and defensive while Colbert stayed calm and methodical. At one point, Trump shouted, "I know more than generals, economists, scientists, everybody." Colbert leaned back in his chair and quietly responded, That sentence right there explains the problem better than I ever could. The audience completely lost it. Trump started attacking Colbert personally now. Your low IQ, terrible ratings, nobody watches your show anymore. Colbert smiled slightly and replied, "See, there it is again. Whenever somebody disagrees with you, suddenly they become low IQ." Huge laughter erupted again. Trump kept repeating the same phrases over and over. Fake news, witch hunt, rigged media, low IQ, corrupt. The more he repeated them, the more desperate he sounded. Meanwhile, Colbert kept returning to facts, verified records, public statements, direct questions. Then Colbert asked the question everybody watching had been waiting for. Donald, if your IQ really is 180, why not release verified test results? The audience instantly reacted loudly. Trump paused for a second, a very noticeable second. Then instead of answering directly, he launched into another rant about dishonest media and political enemies. The audience immediately noticed the dodge. Colbert waited patiently until Trump stopped talking before quietly saying, "That was an incredibly long answer to a very short question." The theater exploded again. Trump pointed angrily toward the camera. "Everybody knows I'm brilliant," he shouted. Colbert calmly answered, "The smartest people I know usually spend more time asking questions than calling themselves geniuses." Huge applause filled the room. Trump looked visibly more frustrated now. His face reddened while his voice got faster and sharper. Colbert, meanwhile, barely changed his expression once. That calmness is what made the segment feel so brutal. It wasn't screaming, it wasn't chaos, it felt like someone slowly dismantling a public image piece by piece. Then Colbert leaned forward slightly and delivered another devastating line. "There's absolutely nothing wrong with not being the smartest person in the room," he said. "Most people aren't. But spending decades pretending you are while insulting everyone else, that's where confidence turns into insecurity." The audience immediately stood up applauding. Trump tried interrupting again, but now even his own arguments sounded scattered. He bounced between topics rapidly. Poll numbers, crowd sizes, television ratings, election conspiracies, lawsuits, media bias. The more he talked, the less focused he sounded. Colbert opened the folder again and calmly continued. "What fascinates me isn't exaggeration," he said. "Politicians exaggerate constantly. What fascinates me is the obsession. The need to constantly remind people how smart you are." The room grew quiet again. Because usually, Colbert added, when someone repeats the same thing for decades, they're not trying to convince you anymore. They're trying to convince themselves. Loud gasps spread across the audience, followed by another explosion of applause. Trump shook his head furiously while trying to interrupt again, but the crowd reaction drowned him out. Colbert continued calmly. "Real intelligence doesn't need branding, it doesn't need slogans, it doesn't need giant gold letters attached to buildings." Another huge audience eruption. Trump's frustration was becoming impossible to hide now. Sweat was visible on his forehead under the lights. He accused Colbert of jealousy and political bias while repeatedly insisting everybody knew he was a genius. But the more emotional Trump became, the calmer Colbert looked sitting behind his desk. That visual alone became one of the most replayed moments online afterward. One man escalating emotionally while the other quietly dismantled the myth without raising his voice. Then Colbert delivered what many viewers later called the most brutal line of the entire night. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If somebody truly had one of the greatest IQs in modern history, you probably wouldn't need to hear about it every single week." The audience absolutely exploded. Long applause filled the theater. Some people were standing, others were wiping tears from laughing so hard. Trump attempted another angry response, but by this point the energy had completely shifted. Earlier in the segment he sounded dominant, now he sounded defensive. Colbert slowly closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. Again, he said calmly, "This isn't about calling Donald Trump stupid. Plenty of successful people are not intellectual geniuses. That's normal. The problem begins when somebody builds an entire public identity around pretending they are while constantly humiliating everyone else." The audience sat listening silently now. "And eventually," Colbert continued softly, "every myth reaches the same dangerous moment. The moment someone finally asks to see the evidence." The audience exploded into another standing ovation. Trump was still talking angrily on the side screen, but his words sounded distant beneath the applause. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. For years, Trump had controlled conversations through confidence and sheer force of personality, but now somebody had calmly asked for proof and refused to move away from the question. Within minutes, the clips from the segment started spreading online at insane speed. Millions of views poured in overnight. Social media feeds filled with reactions from both sides. Some viewers defended Trump and accused Colbert of political bias. Others called it one of the sharpest late-night takedowns ever aired on television. But almost everybody agreed on one thing: Trump looked rattled. The next morning, Trump posted furious responses online calling the segment fake, corrupt, dishonest, and politically motivated. But every angry post only pushed the clips further across the internet. Analysts replayed the footage repeatedly, pointing out how often Trump avoided direct questions while escalating emotionally instead. Even body language experts started breaking down the confrontation frame by frame. Most reached the same conclusion. The calmer Colbert stayed, the more frustrated Trump became. By the end of the week, the segment had become one of the most viral political television moments of the entire year. Not because there was screaming, not because of some shocking scandal, but because viewers watched something rare happen live on television. A public image built almost entirely on confidence finally being forced to sit still long enough for people to examine it closely. And once that happened, the image suddenly didn't look nearly as untouchable anymore. Maybe that's why the moment connected so strongly online, because underneath all the applause, jokes, and political drama was a very simple idea people instantly understood. Confidence is not evidence. Repetition is not proof. And the louder somebody insists they're extraordinary, the more people eventually begin asking why they need to insist so much in the first place. That question hung over the entire segment from beginning to end. Not whether Trump was secretly stupid or secretly brilliant, but why somebody supposedly operating at genius level seems so emotionally desperate for constant validation. By the time the show finally ended, millions of viewers felt like they had already seen the answer for themselves. But the story didn't stop there. The clips kept spreading for days. News channels replayed the confrontation over and over, while commentators debated whether Colbert had crossed a line or simply exposed one. Conservative hosts defended Trump aggressively, arguing that business success itself proved intelligence. Liberal commentators responded by pointing out that intelligence and self-promotion are not automatically the same thing. Meanwhile, social media turned the entire confrontation into a meme storm. Every pause, every facial expression, every awkward dodge from Trump got clipped and reposted millions of times. But the clip that spread fastest wasn't even one of the jokes. It was a simple, quiet moment where Colbert asked for proof and Trump immediately changed the subject. That moment became symbolic because viewers recognized the pattern instantly. For years, Trump had survived criticism by overwhelming conversations emotionally. Louder voice, bigger claim, stronger insult. But this time, somebody refused to engage emotionally. Colbert just kept calmly returning to the same point over and over. Where's the evidence? And without emotional chaos to hide inside, Trump's answers suddenly sounded weaker than usual. Several days later, political analysts were still talking about the confrontation. Some argued the segment mattered because it exposed how modern politics often rewards confidence more than competence. Others argued viewers simply enjoyed seeing someone challenge Trump without fear. But almost every analysis came back to the same central image: Trump becoming visibly more frustrated while Colbert stayed almost unnaturally calm. That contrast gave the segment its power, because viewers could literally watch the emotional balance shift in real time. Early in the segment, Trump sounded dominant and confident. By the end, he sounded defensive and angry, while Colbert barely changed tone once. And maybe that's what truly made the moment viral. Not the insults, not the jokes, not even the political argument itself. It was the visual of a man who built his reputation on always appearing strong, suddenly looking emotionally cornered after somebody calmly asked him to prove his claims. Near the end of the broadcast, Colbert delivered one final line that many viewers completely missed the first time because of the audience applause surrounding it. Looking directly into the camera, he quietly said, "The strongest people in the world usually don't spend every day trying to convince everybody they're strong." It was subtle, almost gentle, but it perfectly summarized the entire segment in one sentence. The audience applauded loudly again while Trump shook his head angrily on the side screen. By then, though, the damage was already done. The internet had made up its mind about the moment. Millions of viewers no longer saw the segment as just another late-night comedy routine. They saw it as a rare moment where confidence finally collided with scrutiny in real time. And once that collision happened under bright lights in front of millions of people, the myth suddenly became much harder to maintain than before. As the applause slowly settled down again, Colbert leaned back in his chair and looked toward the frozen image of Trump on the side screen. For a few seconds, he didn't speak at all. The audience could feel another moment building. Trump was still visibly angry, shaking his head, muttering under his breath, pointing toward the camera as if he was trying to argue with the entire room at once. But Colbert stayed completely still, calm, composed. Then finally he spoke again in a softer voice than before. "Donald, do you know what the strangest part of all this is?" Trump immediately tried interrupting, but Colbert continued anyway. "Nobody actually expected perfection from you." The audience grew quiet, listening carefully. Most Americans don't need their leaders to be superhuman geniuses. They just want honesty. They want competence. They want somebody who can admit mistakes without treating every criticism like a personal attack. Trump shook his head furiously while Colbert continued. "But somewhere along the way, you created a version of yourself that always had to be bigger than reality, smarter than reality, stronger than reality. And once you build a public image like that, eventually it traps you." The audience applauded quietly because the point felt deeper than just another joke. Colbert wasn't mocking Trump anymore. He was dissecting the entire performance. Trump jumped back in aggressively. "I'm the least trapped person you've ever seen," he snapped loudly. "Everybody knows I'm winning." Colbert smiled slightly. "You keep using that word tonight, winning." Then he paused before asking, "Do you know what secure people usually don't need to constantly announce?" Trump frowned immediately. "What?" Colbert answered calmly. "That they're winning." The audience erupted again. Trump looked stunned for a second before immediately launching into another rant about fake news and corrupt media. But by now the rhythm of the conversation had become obvious to everyone watching. Every time Colbert calmly pointed out a contradiction, Trump reacted emotionally instead of directly addressing the point, and viewers could literally watch the cycle repeating itself live on television. Colbert then looked back down at the folder one last time before slowly closing it completely. "You know," he said quietly, "there's a reason this conversation connected with people tonight." The audience listened silently. It's not because people suddenly decided intelligence matters more than character. It's because people are exhausted by performance replacing reality. Huge applause filled the theater. Colbert continued, "We live in a time where confidence gets mistaken for competence constantly. Loudness gets mistaken for leadership. Branding gets mistaken for truth." Trump immediately tried interrupting again, but the audience reaction drowned him out completely. Colbert kept speaking. "And the danger is that eventually people stop asking whether something is true and start asking whether it sounds powerful." The crowd clapped louder now because the point extended far beyond Trump himself. It felt bigger than politics, bigger than late-night television. It felt like Colbert was describing modern culture itself. Trump finally managed to cut back in. "People trust me because I tell the truth," he shouted angrily. Colbert looked directly at him and replied, "No, Donald, people trust confidence. That's not always the same thing." The audience exploded. Some people stood up again clapping while others just stared at the screen in disbelief at how uncomfortable the conversation had become. Trump pointed toward the camera aggressively. "You're just jealous because I became president." Colbert laughed softly for the first time in several minutes. "Donald, you think every criticism is secretly jealousy. That's part of the issue." The audience roared. "Sometimes," Colbert continued, "people challenge you because they genuinely want answers." Trump rolled his eyes dramatically. "I give answers better than anybody," he snapped. Colbert immediately replied, "You give confidence better than anybody." Another huge audience reaction. Trump's frustration was becoming impossible to hide now. His voice sounded tighter, faster, more strained. Meanwhile, Colbert still sounded almost relaxed sitting behind his desk. That contrast had become completely overwhelming by this point in the segment. Then Colbert asked another question that instantly changed the atmosphere again. "Donald, when was the last time you publicly admitted being wrong about something important?" The audience reacted immediately because they knew how dangerous the question was. Trump paused briefly before launching into another defensive speech about fake accusations and political enemies. But once again, he never actually answered the question directly. Colbert nodded slowly while listening. "That's what I thought," he said quietly after Trump stopped talking. The audience burst into applause again. Colbert then leaned forward slightly and spoke more seriously than at any previous moment during the segment. "Do you know why truly intelligent people are usually careful?" he asked. "Because the more you actually learn, the more you realize how much you don't know." The room went almost completely silent. "But your public image works the opposite way," Colbert continued. "You present certainty about everything, every topic, every issue, every crisis, every scientific question, every legal question, every international conflict, and eventually people start noticing that certainty without humility can become dangerous. The audience applauded loudly again. Trump looked furious now. "I know more than these so-called experts," he shouted. Colbert calmly shook his head. "And that sentence right there may explain your entire political career better than anything else." Massive laughter exploded across the theater. But then Colbert unexpectedly softened his tone once more. "Look, honestly, Donald, I don't think this started as some giant manipulation." The audience quieted again. "I think somewhere in your life you learned that appearing weak was unacceptable. So you built armor out of confidence. Bigger buildings, bigger promises, bigger claims, bigger titles, bigger stories, and after a while the performance became the identity." Trump stared angrily into the camera while Colbert continued. "The problem is that eventually maintaining the performance becomes more important than reality itself." The audience clapped again, but this applause sounded different, less comedic, more reflective. Even viewers at home reportedly stopped treating the segment like a comedy routine at this point. It felt strangely personal and psychological now. Trump finally snapped loudly, "I don't need some failed comedian psychoanalyzing me." Colbert smiled slightly, "And yet here you still are." The audience completely lost it again. Long applause echoed through the theater while Trump shook his head angrily. Colbert let the applause continue before delivering another devastating observation. "You know what's fascinating?" he asked calmly. "For somebody who constantly calls other people weak, you spend an incredible amount of time reacting emotionally to criticism." Huge reaction from the crowd. Trump immediately began shouting again about corrupt media and unfair treatment. But the louder he became, the weaker his position seemed to viewers. That was the strange paradox of the entire confrontation. Trump was using the exact same communication style that had helped him dominate headlines for years, but in this setting it suddenly felt unstable instead of powerful because Colbert refused to emotionally escalate alongside him. Colbert then looked directly into the camera and addressed viewers at home. "This is what happens when public image collides with scrutiny," he said calmly. "Not insults, not attacks, just scrutiny." The audience applauded loudly. "Because myths survive through motion," Colbert continued. "If someone is constantly moving, constantly talking, constantly branding themselves, people rarely stop long enough to examine the details closely." He paused before adding softly, "But once the myth finally sits still under bright lights, people start noticing the cracks." The room erupted again. Trump tried speaking over the applause, but nobody could even understand what he was saying anymore. At this point, the audience energy had become overwhelming. Colbert waited patiently until the noise settled before delivering what many viewers later described as the single most devastating line of the entire night. Looking directly at Trump, he said quietly, "Donald, confidence can inspire people. But when confidence becomes disconnected from truth, eventually it stops looking strong and starts looking fragile." The audience instantly stood up applauding. Trump's face visibly tightened. For a brief moment, he didn't say anything at all. And strangely, that silence became one of the most replayed clips online afterward, because viewers weren't used to seeing Trump momentarily speechless on live television. Colbert continued while the applause slowly faded. "The irony is that nobody needed you to be perfect. Nobody needed you to be the smartest man alive. You could have simply been successful, but instead you demanded something impossible. You demanded constant superiority." The audience listened carefully. "And when someone builds their entire identity around superiority," Colbert added softly, "every question starts feeling like an attack." The crowd applauded again. Trump finally recovered and launched back into another emotional rant about enemies, corruption, fake news, and political witch hunts. But by now his words sounded repetitive even to some viewers who supported him politically. The emotional energy that once felt dominant earlier in the segment now felt exhausting. Colbert, meanwhile, remained steady, focused, calm, and that calmness ended up becoming more powerful than shouting. Near the end of the segment, Colbert rested both hands on the closed folder and looked around the theater quietly for several seconds. Then he delivered the final statement that would later dominate headlines the next morning. "Real intelligence," he said softly, "doesn't panic when people ask questions." The audience exploded into one final standing ovation. Long applause thundered through the theater while Trump angrily tried talking over the noise. But nobody was listening anymore. The visual itself had already said everything. One man shouting desperately for control of the conversation, while the other sat quietly allowing the audience reaction to speak for itself. As the applause continued, Colbert leaned slightly toward the camera and added one final sentence almost under his breath. "And maybe that's the difference between confidence and truth. Truth doesn't usually need to yell." The audience erupted even louder than before. Trump shook his head furiously on the side screen while the show prepared to cut away, but by then the moment was already bigger than television. Within hours, the confrontation flooded every corner of the internet. Millions of viewers replayed the clips repeatedly, debating whether Colbert had exposed Trump or simply exposed the power of confidence itself. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: something unusual had happened that night. For a brief moment, one of the loudest personalities in modern politics had been forced to sit still under scrutiny long enough for people to examine the image carefully instead of simply reacting emotionally to it. And once viewers saw the performance slowed down under bright lights, the myth suddenly didn't feel nearly as indestructible as before. That was the real reason the segment went viral. Not because of politics, not because of insults, but because millions of people recognized something deeply familiar hidden underneath the entire confrontation. The difference between appearing powerful and actually being secure. And by the end of the night, many viewers felt like they had just watched that difference reveal itself live on television in front of the entire country.